Security, you might want to remove this man. He's sitting in a seat he clearly doesn't belong in. The woman's voice sliced through the quiet of the private aviation lounge like a blade across glass, loud enough to turn heads from the espresso bar to the wall of panoramic windows overlooking the runway. Darnell Williams didn't move. He remained seated in the leather chair beside the long walnut conference table reserved for executive travelers, his posture relaxed, one hand resting lightly on a slim laptop bag at his feet. Outside the glass, a row of private jets gleamed beneath the late afternoon Texas sun, their polished fuselages reflecting streaks of gold across the tarmac. Inside the lounge, conversations softened to murmurs as curious eyes drifted toward the confrontation unfolding near Gate Charter 3. The woman standing beside Darnell looked every bit the image of upper-tier confidence. Tailored white blazer, diamond bracelet catching the light, designer heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she shifted her weight with visible impatience. She didn't glance at his boarding tablet or the quiet calm in his expression. She only saw what she believed mattered. A black man in a plain charcoal hoodie, sitting in a chair marked reserved. "I'll say it again," she added, folding her arms as if delivering a final verdict. "That seat is for executive partners." Darnell slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers. His gaze was steady, thoughtful, the kind of calm that seemed almost out of place in a room growing tighter with tension. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice even and unhurried. "I'm aware." The response seemed to irritate her more than resistance would have. She glanced toward the reception desk where a young attendant hesitated, unsure whether to step in or stay silent. "Then move," the woman said sharply. "You're holding up people who actually belong here." A few nearby passengers exchanged looks. One man in a Navy travel suit subtly lowered his newspaper. Another traveler paused mid-sip of coffee, sensing the moment stretch longer than it should. But Darnell didn't rush. He leaned back slightly in the chair, as if the accusation had merely brushed past him like wind against glass. 20 years earlier, he might have reacted differently. 20 years earlier, he might have stood up immediately, apologized, and walked away. The memory flickered through his mind with quiet clarity. A crowded airport lounge in Chicago, the same suspicious stares, the same assumption that someone like him had wandered somewhere he didn't belong. That day had stayed with him longer than any flight ever could. It had followed him through graduate school, through boardrooms, through the long nights building an investment firm that would eventually purchase stakes in transportation companies across the country. And now here he was again, in another quiet room filled with polished surfaces and silent judgments. The woman exhaled sharply and turned toward the desk. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Call security." The attendant hesitated again, fingers hovering over the phone. Darnell watched the moment unfold with the patience of someone who understood exactly how predictable the scene had become. Slowly, he reached down and placed his laptop bag beside the chair leg, then looked back up at the woman who was already convinced she had won the argument. His voice, when it came, was calm enough that several people leaned closer just to hear it. "Before anyone calls security," Darnell said evenly, "are you absolutely certain that's the seat you want?" The woman hesitated for only half a second before her expression hardened again, as if the question itself annoyed her. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying across the polished room. "I am absolutely certain." The lounge fell into that strange quiet that happens when a public moment stretches just a little too long. The receptionist behind the marble desk shifted awkwardly, glancing from the woman to Darnell and back again, unsure whose authority mattered more. The soft hum of the espresso machine filled the pause. Outside the tall glass windows, a Gulfstream jet rolled slowly across the runway while ground crew in neon vests moved with practiced precision beneath the fading afternoon sun. Inside, however, the air had changed. Darnell Williams remained seated as though time itself moved slower around him. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply watched the woman with the same calm attention one might give to a problem that had already been solved. She misread that calm entirely. "Unbelievable," she muttered, stepping closer to the chair as though proximity alone would force him to move. Her heels tapped sharply against the marble floor, echoing through the quiet lounge. "People like you walk in here every week thinking you can sit wherever you want." A few heads turned more openly now. The man with the newspaper folded it completely and set it on the table. A young traveler near the charging station slowly removed one earbud. Nobody spoke, but the tension had begun to ripple outward across the room like heat rising from pavement. Darnell tilted his head slightly. "People like me?" he asked, his tone still measured. The woman waved a dismissive hand, as if clarifying the obvious. "People who do not belong in executive lounges." She gestured toward the polished brass plaque mounted beside the chair. "Reserved for partner executives. Those seats are not for casual travelers in sweatshirts." The receptionist finally lifted the phone from the desk, uncertain but pressured by the woman's growing impatience. "Should I contact security?" she asked carefully. The woman nodded immediately. "Yes, please do." Darnell did not interrupt. Instead, he glanced briefly at the plaque beside the chair, then back at the woman, as if confirming something in his own mind. "You seem very confident," he said quietly. "Of course I am confident," she replied with a small laugh that carried more irritation than humor. "My company flies through this lounge every month." Several people nearby exchanged looks at the phrasing. "My company." The woman clearly believed the statement carried weight, and in many rooms it probably did. Darnell nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the information. "That is good to know." The receptionist hesitated again before pressing the call button on the desk phone. Somewhere deeper in the terminal, a security supervisor would soon receive the message that there was a seating dispute inside the executive charter lounge. But before the call even connected, a new voice entered the moment. "Excuse me," someone said quietly from the row of leather chairs near the window. A young man in a gray blazer stood up, holding a tablet in one hand. He looked uncertain but curious, his eyes moving between the woman and Darnell. "I think that seat was already assigned." The woman turned sharply toward him. "Assigned to whom?" she demanded. The man glanced at the tablet screen, then back toward Darnell as if double-checking what he was seeing. "The reservation system showed a partner executive arriving this afternoon," he said. The name was Williams. The woman scoffed immediately. "That cannot be correct." Darnell remained silent, though a faint trace of amusement touched the corner of his expression. The young man looked again at the screen, scrolling once with his thumb. "It says the executive partner is scheduled for the 5 o'clock charter departure." The woman crossed her arms tightly. "Then you are looking at the wrong system." The receptionist finally lowered the phone slightly, uncertainty creeping into her voice. "Sir," she asked the young man, "are you with the airline operations team?" "Yes," he replied. "I handle scheduling audits." The woman's confidence wavered for the first time, though only slightly. She turned back toward Darnell with narrowed eyes. "Even if that were true," she said, "you still have not shown any credentials." Darnell slowly leaned forward in the chair, resting his elbows lightly on his knees. His expression remained calm, thoughtful, almost patient. Around the room, several travelers were now watching openly. The quiet had transformed into something heavier, something expectant. Darnell looked at the woman for a long moment before speaking again. "You asked for credentials," he said evenly. "That seems reasonable." He reached into the pocket of his jacket, not hurried, not defensive, simply deliberate. The woman watched the movement with growing curiosity, convinced she was moments away from proving her point. Darnell pulled out his phone and unlocked the screen with a calm swipe of his thumb. Then he lifted it to his ear and spoke in a steady voice that carried across the silent lounge. "Carla," he said, "could you confirm something for me?" Carla answered on the second ring, her voice calm and precise even through the small speaker of Darnell's phone. "Good afternoon, Mr. Williams," she said. "How can I assist you?" The woman standing beside the chair blinked once, clearly surprised that the conversation had moved so smoothly into something official. Darnell's tone remained relaxed. "Carla, I need you to verify a partner executive seat assignment in the charter lounge at Dallas Executive Terminal," he said. The receptionist behind the desk lowered the phone in her hand completely now, uncertainty written across her face as she listened. Carla did not hesitate. "One moment while I check the system," she replied. The quiet that followed felt heavier than before. Outside the windows, the private jets still glowed in the late afternoon sun, but inside the lounge the atmosphere had tightened like a drawn wire. The woman folded her arms again, though the confidence in her posture had shifted slightly. "You really think a phone call changes anything?" she said. Darnell glanced up at her briefly, but did not respond. Across the room, the young operations auditor who had spoken earlier watched closely, his tablet still open in his hand, as if waiting for confirmation that his screen had not been wrong. Several travelers had now stopped pretending to ignore the situation entirely. One couple near the window leaned closer together, whispering quietly. A businessman standing near the charging station had begun scrolling his phone, but kept glancing up at the unfolding moment. Carla returned to the line within seconds. "Mr. Williams, I see the reservation," she said. "Executive Partner Lounge, seat number 3. Assigned under your arrival at 4:45 p.m. with charter departure scheduled for 5 o'clock." The young auditor nodded slightly to himself when he heard the confirmation. The woman beside Darnell's chair stiffened but quickly masked the reaction with a small dismissive laugh. "That still does not prove anything," she said loudly. "Anyone can say a name over the phone." Darnell rested one arm along the back of the chair, his expression unchanged. "Carla," he continued, "could you also confirm who authorized that seat reservation?" There was a brief pause on the line as keyboard clicks echoed faintly from Carla's office hundreds of miles away. "Yes," she said a moment later. "The reservation was authorized directly through partner protocol." The receptionist slowly stepped out from behind the desk now, curiosity replacing her earlier uncertainty. The woman shook her head as if rejecting the entire conversation. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You are clearly manipulating the system somehow." The operations auditor raised his eyebrows slightly at that suggestion, but remained silent. Carla spoke again, her tone still perfectly professional. "Mr. Williams, would you like me to notify the terminal management team that you have arrived?" That question landed in the center of the room like a dropped coin in a quiet hall. The woman frowned. "Terminal management?" she repeated. Darnell leaned forward slightly, still speaking into the phone. "Not yet," he said calmly. "I just wanted to make sure the system had not made a mistake." Carla responded without hesitation. "The system is correct, Mr. Williams. Seat 3 in the Partner Executive Lounge is reserved under your authorization." A soft murmur moved through the watching travelers. The receptionist looked from Darnell to the plaque beside the chair again, clearly reconsidering everything. She had assumed when the argument began. The woman exhaled sharply through her nose. "That is not possible," she insisted. "My company books through this terminal every month." Darnell slowly lowered the phone from his ear, but did not end the call. Carla remained on the line quietly. "You mentioned that earlier," he said. The woman lifted her chin slightly. "Yes, I did." Darnell studied her for a long moment, as if measuring something beyond the obvious tension in the room. The late afternoon sunlight shifted across the marble floor as another jet taxied past the windows outside. Finally, he spoke again, his voice steady enough that everyone nearby could hear each word clearly. "You said your company flies through this lounge every month," he said. The woman nodded, eager to reclaim control of the conversation. "That is correct." Darnell gave a small, thoughtful nod, then raised the phone again. "Carla," he said evenly, "could you also confirm who owns the charter group that operates this terminal?" Carla answered immediately. "The charter group is owned by Skybridge Aviation Holdings." The woman frowned slightly at the name. Darnell continued with the same calm tone. "And who is the majority shareholder of Skybridge Aviation Holdings?" There was a very brief pause before Carla spoke again. "You are Mr. Williams." The silence that followed spread across the lounge like a sudden change in air pressure. Even the hum of the espresso machine seemed to fade as the meaning of that answer settled slowly into the room. For a moment, nobody spoke. The answer from Carla still seemed to hang in the air like the echo of a bell. "You are Mr. Williams." The young operations auditor slowly lowered his tablet, his eyes moving from the screen to Darnell as the realization began settling into place. The receptionist's posture changed entirely, her shoulders straightening as if she had suddenly remembered a training manual she should have followed from the beginning. Even the couple near the window stopped whispering. The woman beside Darnell's chair remained standing, but the confidence that had filled her voice minutes earlier had drained into something uncertain. "That cannot be correct," she said, though her tone carried far less certainty than before. Darnell rested the phone back against his ear. "Thank you, Carla," he said calmly. "That is all I needed for the moment." "Of course, Mr. Williams," Carla replied. "Please, let me know if you need terminal management notified of your arrival." "I will," Darnell said, ending the call with a quiet tap of his thumb. The lounge remained silent for another long second. Outside the window, A jet engine roared to life somewhere on the runway. But inside the room the sound felt distant, almost unreal compared to the shift happening among the people watching. The woman cleared her throat and straightened her blazer. "That does not mean you own this lounge," she said quickly, as if trying to rebuild the ground beneath her argument. "There are many investors in aviation companies." Darnell looked at her with the same calm patience he had shown from the beginning. "That is true," he said. The operations auditor stepped closer now, curiosity overtaking hesitation. "Skybridge Aviation Holdings," he said slowly, thinking aloud. "That is the parent company that acquired this charter terminal 2 years ago." He glanced at Darnell again with a growing look of recognition. "Wait." The receptionist blinked. "Acquired?" she repeated quietly. The auditor nodded, now clearly remembering the internal reports he had once reviewed. "Yes. The majority shareholder led the purchase when they expanded the executive charter division." His eyes returned to Darnell with new clarity. The woman noticed the shift immediately. "You cannot seriously believe this," she said, looking around the room as if searching for agreement. But the expressions she met were no longer confident. They were thoughtful, observant, even sympathetic toward the man still sitting quietly in the reserved chair. Darnell did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward or attempt to claim the moment. Instead, he simply rested his hands together and watched the room with the calm of someone who had already lived through this kind of scene more times than he cared to count. The receptionist finally spoke again, her voice careful now. "Sir," she said to Darnell, "may I confirm your name for the terminal registry?" Darnell looked toward her with a small nod. "Darnell Williams." The operations auditor exhaled softly, as if a final piece had fallen into place. "That is the name," he said, almost to himself. "Darnell Williams." The woman beside the chair froze slightly when she heard it spoken aloud. She had heard the name before. Not in person, not in a lounge like this, but in business reports, aviation articles, financial news segments discussing the quiet investor who had reshaped several regional charter companies into a single national network. She looked back at Darnell again, studying him more carefully this time. The hoodie, the simple travel bag, the calm that had never cracked no matter how confidently she had insisted he did not belong there. The receptionist quickly stepped back behind the desk and began typing on her terminal. The glow of the screen reflected faintly in her glasses as she searched the executive registry. A few seconds passed before her eyes widened slightly. She looked up again, her tone suddenly formal. "Mr. Williams," she said respectfully, "welcome to the Skybridge Executive Charter Lounge." The words seemed to ripple across the room. The couple near the window exchanged surprised looks. The businessman by the charging station quietly lowered his phone, now fully focused on what was unfolding. The woman standing beside Darnell's chair said nothing at first. Her posture had gone still, as if her mind was racing through every moment that had happened since she first walked into the lounge. Darnell finally stood up slowly, not in anger, not in triumph, but simply because the conversation had reached its natural turning point. He looked at the plaque beside the chair one last time before meeting the woman's eyes again. "You were certain that this was the seat you wanted," he said calmly. Darnell Williams stood beside the reserved chair with the same composed expression he had carried from the beginning, his posture relaxed, his voice steady as the quiet tension inside the executive lounge continued to thicken. The woman in the white blazer looked at him as though the ground beneath her argument had shifted and she had not yet decided whether to deny it or accept it. "You were certain that this was the seat you wanted," Darnell said calmly, repeating the thought he had just spoken. His tone carried no anger and no mockery, only a measured clarity that made the moment feel even heavier. The woman glanced briefly toward the receptionist's desk, where the terminal screen still displayed the registry entry that had confirmed his identity. She forced a small laugh that sounded thin in the quiet room. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said quickly. "I did not realize that seat was assigned to someone important." Several people nearby exchanged subtle looks at the wording of that sentence. Darnell noticed it too, though his expression did not change. "Someone important," he repeated softly, as if considering the phrase. The operations auditor standing nearby shifted his weight slightly and folded his tablet against his chest. The receptionist remained behind the desk with her hands carefully folded together now, watching the exchange with an attention that had completely replaced her earlier uncertainty. Outside the windows, the late afternoon sun dipped lower across the runway, casting long golden reflections along the polished floor. Inside the lounge, the moment seemed suspended. Darnell walked a slow step around the chair, resting one hand briefly along the back of the leather seat before turning again toward the woman. "Earlier you said something interesting," he continued in that same calm voice. "You said people like me walk into places like this every week." The woman's shoulders tightened slightly. She opened her mouth as if preparing to respond, but the words did not arrive as quickly this time. Darnell did not rush her. Instead, his eyes moved briefly across the quiet room, taking in the travelers who had now become witnesses to the entire scene. The man who had been reading the newspaper earlier now leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. The couple near the window watched with careful attention. Even the soft music playing through the ceiling speakers seemed quieter than before. Darnell returned his gaze to the woman again. "You may not remember this," he said, "but I do." The words carried the weight of something older than the moment unfolding in the lounge. For a second, the room felt as though it had stepped backward in time with him. "About 20 years ago," Darnell continued slowly, "I stood outside an airport lounge in Chicago wearing a borrowed jacket because I had just finished my first consulting job." The operations auditor lowered his eyes slightly, listening now not as an employee, but as a witness to a story unfolding. "I remember the man at the front desk looked at me the same way you looked at me when you walked in here," Darnell said. "He told me the lounge was not for people like me." The woman's expression shifted again, though she said nothing. "I believed him at the time," Darnell added quietly. "I turned around and left because I thought maybe he was right." A soft murmur moved through one side of the room as several travelers exchanged glances. Darnell rested his hands loosely together again. "That moment stayed with me longer than the flight I was waiting for," he said. "It followed me through every meeting, every investment deal, every boardroom where I had to prove I deserved to sit at the table." He paused briefly, letting the meaning settle into the quiet air around them. "Eventually I decided something," he said. The receptionist leaned forward slightly behind the desk, without realizing she had done it. "If the doors were not going to open," Darnell continued, "then I would buy the building." The operations auditor gave a small nod to himself, as if that single sentence explained years of corporate expansion reports he had once studied. The woman standing in front of Darnell now looked far less certain than she had when she first walked into the lounge. "I did not mean anything by what I said earlier," she replied quickly. "You misunderstood." Darnell considered her words with the same patience he had shown all along. "Perhaps," he said calmly. He glanced briefly at the plaque beside the chair again, the one that had started the entire confrontation, reserved for partner executives. Then he looked back at her. "But the interesting thing about assumptions," he continued softly, "is that they usually reveal more about the person making them than the person hearing them." The silence that followed stretched across the lounge once again, but this time the atmosphere had shifted completely. The tension no longer centered around whether Darnell belonged in the seat. That question had already been answered. Now the entire room seemed to be waiting to see what he would say next. The silence that followed Darnell Williams's words did not feel empty. It felt full, heavy with realization slowly moving through the lounge like a quiet tide. The woman in the white blazer shifted her weight again, her heels tapping once against the marble floor before she caught herself and stood still. The confidence she had carried into the room earlier had faded into something far more cautious. "Look," she said finally, her voice softer now. "I think this situation has gotten out of hand." No one in the room spoke. The receptionist remained behind the desk with her hands folded neatly together, her attention fixed on Darnell with a level of respect that had replaced her earlier hesitation. The operations auditor still held his tablet, though he had not looked at the screen in several minutes. Darnell studied the woman calmly, the same thoughtful expression resting on his face. "It became out of hand the moment assumptions entered the room," he replied. The woman nodded quickly as if agreeing with him would help close the conversation. "Exactly," she said. "So perhaps we can just move forward." Darnell tilted his head slightly, considering the suggestion. "Move forward," he repeated. The phrase hung between them for a moment. Outside the glass wall of the lounge, a sleek, white private jet rolled slowly toward the hangar, its engines humming steadily across the runway. Inside the lounge, the quiet had changed again. The earlier tension had dissolved into something more reflective. Several travelers were no longer pretending to look away. They watched openly now, curious about how the moment would end. Darnell took a slow breath and walked toward the large window overlooking the runway. For a moment, he simply stood there, his hands resting loosely at his sides while he looked out at the aircraft preparing for departure. The setting sun stretched long shadows across the tarmac. When he spoke again, his voice carried across the room without rising in volume. "Do you know why I keep these lounges exactly the way they are?" he asked. The woman hesitated, clearly unsure whether the question was directed at her or the room itself. "No," she answered cautiously. Darnell turned back toward the lounge. "Because spaces like this are supposed to represent opportunity," he said. "They are supposed to be places where people preparing for important work can sit quietly and think." The operations auditor nodded slightly, understanding the idea immediately. Darnell continued, "But too often they become places where people decide who deserves to sit down and who does not." The woman lowered her eyes briefly before looking back up. "I understand what you are saying," she replied. Darnell studied her for a moment. "Do you?" he asked gently. The question was not confrontational, but it carried a weight that made the room feel still again. The woman hesitated. "I admit that I judged the situation too quickly," she said. "If that caused offense, I apologize." The words sounded practiced, as though they had been used before in professional settings where quick resolutions mattered. Darnell listened carefully without interrupting. The receptionist glanced between them, sensing that the moment had reached a turning point. The operations auditor quietly shifted his stance again, waiting. Darnell walked back toward the reserved chair and rested his hand along the top of it once more. "You said earlier that your company flies through this terminal every month," he said. The woman nodded. "Yes." Darnell gave a small, thoughtful nod. "That means you understand how important reputation is in business." "Of course," she replied quickly. "Reputation determines everything." Darnell's expression softened slightly, though the calm seriousness in his voice remained. "That is true," he said. "And reputation is built in moments exactly like this." The woman looked at him carefully now, clearly realizing that the conversation was no longer about a chair in a lounge. Darnell continued speaking with the same measured tone. "I did not call anyone to remove you from this room," he said. "I did not ask security to escort you out." The receptionist glanced down briefly, aware that earlier the woman herself had nearly requested that exact outcome for him. Darnell continued, "Because power does not need to shout to prove it exists." The room remained completely silent as his words settled over everyone present. The couple by the window exchanged a quiet look. The businessman near the charging station slowly nodded to himself. The woman in the white blazer seemed smaller than she had when she first entered the lounge. Darnell looked at her for a final moment before speaking again. "But there is something I do expect," he said calmly. The lounge waited for the rest of Darnell Williams's sentence the same way people wait for thunder after lightning. He stood beside the reserved chair with quiet composure, the evening sunlight stretching across the marble floor behind him. The woman in the white blazer held his gaze, though the certainty she had carried into the room earlier had completely dissolved. Darnell spoke again with the same calm tone that had guided the entire conversation. "But there is something I do expect," he said. No one moved. Even the receptionist behind the desk seemed to hold her breath. Darnell continued, "I expect people who share the same space to show the same level of respect." The words were simple, but the weight behind them settled deeply into the room. The woman lowered her eyes for a moment before looking back up at him. "You are right," she said quietly. "I should not have assumed anything about you." The admission sounded sincere, though it arrived much later than the confidence that had sparked the confrontation. Darnell nodded once, acknowledging the statement without exaggerating its importance. "Assumptions are easy," he replied. "They require very little effort." The operations auditor standing nearby listened closely, recognizing that the moment had turned into something far more meaningful than a disagreement over a chair. Darnell rested his hand again along the back of the reserved seat and continued speaking in that steady voice. "Understanding takes more work." The woman exhaled slowly. "I see that now." Darnell studied her expression carefully, as though measuring whether the realization had truly reached her. Around the room, several travelers shifted slightly in their chairs, still watching the scene unfold with quiet attention. The couple near the window had stopped whispering entirely. The businessman by the charging station stood still with his arms folded, clearly invested in the outcome of the moment. Darnell looked around the lounge briefly before returning his attention to the woman again. "Earlier you asked for credentials," he said. "You wanted proof that I belonged here." The woman nodded slowly. "Yes." Darnell gave a small, thoughtful smile, though it carried no hint of triumph. "That is fair," he said. "In business we verify everything." The receptionist behind the desk gave a slight nod in agreement. Darnell then gestured lightly toward the plaque beside the chair. "But belonging is not always written on a sign," he continued. The operations auditor quietly tapped the edge of his tablet against his hand, as if the words had triggered a realization about the many systems and lists he worked with every day. Darnell continued speaking, his voice calm but firm. "Sometimes belonging is about recognizing the value of the person sitting across from you before you know their title." The woman listened carefully now, no longer interrupting or rushing to respond. "I understand," she said. Darnell paused for a moment, and then added one more sentence, the one that finally brought the entire moment into focus. "Because when you asked me to leave this seat," he said gently, "you did not realize something important." The room felt completely still again. The receptionist's eyes moved between the two of them. The operations auditor leaned slightly forward. Darnell looked directly at the woman and spoke the words with quiet clarity. "You asked the owner of this company to move." The statement landed softly but decisively, like a final piece clicking into place. The woman froze where she stood. Her eyes widened slightly as the full meaning of his words finally settled into the room. She had heard the earlier confirmation on the phone. She had seen the registry on the terminal screen. But hearing the truth spoken plainly in front of everyone changed the moment entirely. Darnell did not raise his voice. He did not repeat himself. He simply allowed the silence to do the work. After several seconds, the woman finally spoke again, her voice much quieter than before. "I did not know," she said. Darnell nodded slowly. "That is exactly the point," he replied. The words lingered in the lounge long after Darnell Williams spoke them. "That is exactly the point." The woman in the white blazer stood motionless for a moment, her eyes fixed on him as the full weight of the realization settled in. Around them, the quiet room seemed to absorb the moment like still water absorbing a stone. The receptionist behind the desk slowly straightened her posture, her earlier uncertainty now replaced with a calm professionalism that matched the gravity of the situation. The operations auditor lowered his tablet slightly and watched with quiet respect. The other travelers in the lounge no longer pretended to mind their own business. Every set of eyes had turned toward the center of the room, where the conversation had quietly transformed into something larger than a disagreement about a seat. The woman finally spoke again, her voice no longer sharp or defensive. "I truly did not know," she repeated. Darnell studied her for a moment, not with anger but with the measured patience of someone who had spent years navigating rooms exactly like this one. "Most people do not," he replied calmly. The words were not accusatory. They were simply honest. The woman glanced down briefly, then looked back up. "I should not have judged you so quickly," she admitted. The sentence came more slowly this time, as if she were choosing each word carefully. Darnell nodded once. "Recognition is the first step toward change," he said quietly. The evening light outside the large windows had shifted again, the sun dipping lower toward the horizon as a private jet lifted into the sky beyond. The runway. The warm glow spread across the polished floor, casting long reflections that seemed to soften the tension that had filled the lounge only minutes earlier. The operations auditor finally spoke again, his voice respectful. "Mr. Williams," he said, "it is an honor to meet you." Darnell gave a small nod in acknowledgement. "Thank you." The receptionist stepped forward from behind the desk, her tone now careful and professional. "Mr. Williams, if there is anything the lounge staff can do to make your visit more comfortable, please let us know." Darnell offered a polite smile. "I appreciate that." The woman standing in front of him took a slow breath as if gathering the courage to continue. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not just for the seat, for the way I spoke to you." The room remained silent as everyone waited for Darnell's response. He did not rush to answer. Instead, he looked around the lounge briefly, noticing the attentive faces of the people who had witnessed the entire exchange. When he spoke again, his voice remained calm and steady. "An apology matters when it leads to understanding," he said. The woman nodded quickly. "It does." Darnell studied her expression for another moment before continuing. This industry is built on movement, he said. Planes taking off, people traveling, companies expanding. The operations auditor listened closely, recognizing the perspective of someone who had shaped much of that expansion. But progress in business should also mean progress in how we treat each other, Darnell added. The woman lowered her gaze slightly in acknowledgement. You are right. Darnell rested his hand lightly against the back of the reserved chair again. Every person who walks into a place like this carries a story you cannot see, he said. Some of those stories are about hard work. Some are about sacrifice. Some are about overcoming doors that were closed before anyone even asked who was knocking. The travelers around the room remained completely still as his words settled into the quiet space. Darnell continued, his tone thoughtful rather than dramatic. When someone assumes another person does not belong, they are not only misunderstanding that person. They are misunderstanding the entire purpose of opportunity. The woman listened carefully, no longer trying to defend herself. Darnell finally stepped slightly to the side of the reserved chair, giving her space again within the lounge. What matters now, he said calmly, is what you choose to do with what you have learned. The woman met his gaze once more and nodded slowly. I will remember this moment, she said. Darnell gave a small nod in return. The tension that had filled the lounge earlier had completely faded, replaced by a quiet sense of reflection among everyone present. Outside the window, the sky had turned a deeper shade of gold as another aircraft prepared for departure. Inside the lounge, the conversation had ended, but the lesson it carried lingered in the room long after the final words were spoken. Darnell Williams remained beside the reserved chair as the quiet reflections settled across the lounge. The tension that had once filled the room had transformed into something calmer, almost thoughtful, like the quiet that follows a long storm after the clouds finally move away. The woman in the white blazer stood across from him with a different posture now, her shoulders no longer squared in certainty, but relaxed in understanding. Around them, the travelers who had watched the moment unfold slowly returned to their seats, though their attention still lingered on the man whose calm presence had changed the entire room without a single raised voice. Outside the tall glass windows, the Texas sky had turned amber as the sun moved toward the horizon. A private jet lifted gracefully from the runway and climbed into the evening air, its engines fading into the distance as it carried another group of passengers toward their destinations. Inside the lounge, the moment had become quiet again, but the meaning of what had happened still lived in the space between everyone present. The woman finally spoke again, her voice steady but reflective. Thank you for not responding the way many people would have, she said. Darnell looked at her thoughtfully. Anger does not teach anything, he replied calmly. It only ends conversations. The operations auditor standing nearby nodded quietly, clearly recognizing the truth in that statement. The receptionist behind the desk had returned to her terminal, but every few seconds her eyes still lifted toward Darnell with a subtle expression of respect. The woman took another breath. I will remember what you said, she told him. Darnell gave a small nod, acknowledging the promise without dramatizing it. Moments like this are easier to forget than people realize, he said. But the lesson stays, if you choose to carry it. The room fell silent again, though the silence now felt comfortable rather than tense. The businessman who had been standing near the charging station finally walked closer and offered a respectful handshake. Mr. Williams, it was an honor watching how you handled that, he said. Darnell shook his hand warmly. Thank you. The couple who had been sitting by the window also nodded politely as they gathered their travel bags, clearly preparing for their own departure. One of them whispered quietly, "That was powerful," before stepping toward the exit doors. Darnell returned to the reserved chair and sat down again, his posture relaxed, as though the moment had never been about the seat at all. The plaque beside the chair still reflected the fading sunlight. Reserved for partner executives. The words no longer felt like a barrier. They felt like a reminder of the journey that had brought him there. For a brief moment his mind drifted back to the memory he had shared earlier, the younger version of himself standing outside a lounge in Chicago decades ago, believing that someone else had the authority to decide where he belonged. That version of Darnell had walked away quietly that day, but he had carried the experience with him into every decision that followed. He had built companies, purchased opportunities, and created spaces where the doors would open wider for the next generation than they had for him. Now he sat inside one of those spaces watching the evening sky deepen beyond the runway. The woman remained nearby for another moment before speaking one last time. "You said earlier that assumptions reveal more about the person making them," she said. Darnell looked up at her again. "Yes." She nodded slowly. "I see that now." Darnell offered a calm smile. Then the moment served its purpose. The operations auditor glanced at the departure board mounted along the wall and spoke up respectfully. "Mr. Williams, your charter flight will be boarding in about 15 minutes. Darnell stood and picked up his laptop bag from beside the chair. "Thank you." As he walked toward the large windows for one last look at the runway, the final glow of sunlight stretched across the horizon. The aircraft waiting for him stood ready beyond the glass, its polished wings reflecting the colors of the evening sky. Darnell paused there for a moment before turning back toward the room. His voice carried calmly through the lounge, not loud but clear enough for everyone to hear. "The truth is simple," he said. "Respect should never depend on what someone is wearing, where they are sitting, or what you assume about them." The travelers in the room listened quietly as his final words settled into the calm space. Darnell adjusted the strap of his bag over his shoulder and walked toward the exit that led to the runway. Just before stepping through the door, he spoke one last sentence, the kind of statement that lingers long after the moment ends. "I did not raise my voice today," he said calmly. "I raised the standard." Then he stepped outside toward the waiting aircraft as the evening sky deepened over the quiet runway behind him.